Imagine a disease so terrible it made people's insides turn black before they died. Picture entire villages where the only sound was the wind because everyone was gone. One plague wiped out so many soldiers that enemies just walked across the border. Another one caused people to throw themselves into wells just to cool their burning fevers. These weren't movie plots. They were real events that changed the world forever. Before doctors understood germs, these invisible enemies arrived like ghosts, leaving death and chaos in their wake, and nothing was ever the same again. Number 9. The Prehistoric Burnt House Epidemic that wiped a village off the map. Long, long ago, around 5,000 years back, in a place now called Heiminmangka in northeastern China, a whole village vanished. Archaeologists digging there found something super creepy. They unearthed the house, just under 30 square meters, that had been burned down. Inside, crammed together, were the skeletons of 97 people. Yes, 97 bodies, all pushed into one small house before it was set on fire. These weren't people who died in a battle. Their bones didn't show signs of violence, like cuts or arrow wounds. They were people of all ages, young, adults, teenagers, and middle-aged folks. The bodies were jumbled, not carefully buried. Some were piled in the middle, others were stuffed into a ceramic pot, and more were scattered around what seemed to be the doorway, as if they were trying to get out. It looked like a scene of pure panic. Even creepier, another site nearby from the same period, called Myeolzigu, showed a similar thing. More mass burials, people just gone very quickly. Archaeologists think a super-fast, deadly epidemic must have hit these places. There was no time for proper burials. The survivors, if there were any, just wanted to contain whatever horror had struck. Burning the house with the bodies inside might have been a desperate attempt to stop the sickness from spreading, or maybe a ritual to cleanse the area. Whatever it was, it worked in a brutal way. The village at Heiminmangka was never lived in again. It was abandoned, left to the ghosts and the ashes. This wasn't a plague that toppled an empire, because empires as we know them were just beginning. But it showed that even in prehistoric times, tiny, invisible killers could suddenly erase entire communities. It reminds us that epidemics are an ancient enemy. Imagine the terror for those people with no understanding of what was happening, watching their loved ones die rapidly from an unseen force. Their solution was drastic: seal the dead, burn the house, and run. It's a chilling glimpse into how our distant ancestors faced a sudden, overwhelming health crisis. The site became a mass grave, a silent monument to a forgotten plague that reshaped life for those who lived near it, teaching a harsh lesson about disease and survival. Number 8. The Athenian Plague that made people too mad to mourn. In 430 BC, Athens was the superstar of ancient Greece. It was a city of democracy, philosophy, amazing art, and a powerful navy. It was also locked in a massive war with its rival, Sparta, the Peloponnesian War. To protect its citizens from Spartan raids, the Athenian leader Pericles brought everyone from the countryside inside the city's massive defensive walls. It was a smart military move, but it turned Athens into a crowded, ticking time bomb. Then, something terrible arrived by ship at Athens port: Piraeus. It was a disease, and it spread like wildfire through the packed city. The historian Thucydides, who caught it himself and survived, wrote an absolutely terrifying account. He said people would suddenly get burning fevers, their eyes would turn red and inflamed, Their throats and tongues would bleed, and their breath became unnatural and foul. Sneezing and hoarseness came next, then a nasty cough. The sickness would settle in the chest, causing stomach aches and vomiting of every kind of bile. Most people had agonizing, empty retching and strong convulsions. The skin wasn't too hot to touch on the outside, but inside people burned so much that they couldn't stand to wear any clothes or linen. They longed to throw themselves into cold water. Many of those left uncared for actually did jump into wells, driven mad by unquenchable thirst. No matter how much they drank, it made no difference. A restless inability to sleep and constant tossing and turning also plagued the sick. If they survived past 7 or 9 days, the disease went down into their bowels, causing severe ulceration and uncontrollable diarrhea, which often killed them from sheer exhaustion. The disease, Thucydides wrote, started in the head and went through the whole body. If people did survive the worst, the plague often marked them, attacking their extremities, fingers, toes, and even their private parts. Some people went blind. Others lost all their memories when they recovered, not knowing who they were or recognizing their friends. Doctors were helpless. In fact, they died in droves because they were the ones most in contact with the sick. Prayers and oracles didn't work either. So many people were dying. Thucydides estimated that up to 1/3 of the Athenian population, including soldiers and sailors, perished. The city's social fabric unraveled. People saw others dying, whether they behaved well or badly. So they just decided to live for pleasure, thinking they might be dead tomorrow. No one wanted to follow laws or do their duty. Burial customs were abandoned. Bodies were piled up and left in the streets, or people would throw their dead relatives onto other people's funeral pyres. Temples were full of corpses of people who had gone there to pray. The plague severely weakened Athens. Pericles himself died from it. It didn't end the war immediately, but it shattered Athenian confidence and manpower. Sparta even hesitated to invade Athenian territory, scared of catching the disease. Athens, once so proud and powerful, was brought to its knees, not just by Spartan spears, but by an invisible enemy that turned its crowded strength into a deadly weakness. It changed the course of the war and marked the beginning of the end for Athens' golden age. The psychological toll was immense, a sense of divine abandonment and utter chaos, reshaping how Athenians saw their gods, their society, and their place in the world. Number 7. The Antonine Plague that forced Rome to recruit gladiators. Imagine the mighty Roman Empire in the 2nd century CE, at the peak of its power under Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king. Things seemed pretty good. Then around 165 CE, Roman soldiers returning from campaigns in the Near East brought back an unwelcome souvenir, a devastating pestilence. This became known as the Antonine Plague, named after Marcus Aurelius's family name, Antoninus. Some historians think it might have been smallpox, or perhaps measles, but whatever it was horrid. The famous physician Galen, who was around at the time, described the symptoms. Sufferers experienced high fever, diarrhea, and vomiting. A key symptom was a nasty skin rash, full of pustules that appeared around the 9th day. If the pustules were black, the person usually died. If they weren't black, they would dry up and fall off, leaving dark scars. People also suffered from horrible inflammation of the mouth and throat, ulcers, and a terrible cough. It sounds absolutely dreadful. Plague raged for about 15 years, coming in waves. At its worst, it was reportedly killing 2,000 people a day in the city of Rome. The total death toll across the vast Roman Empire is estimated to be around 5 million people. Some sources claim that entire towns and districts were depopulated. Think about that. 5 million dead, from Britain to Egypt. In some areas, up to a third of the population may have perished. This had a massive impact on the Roman army, which was the backbone of the empire's power. Legions were hollowed out by the disease. So many soldiers died that Marcus Aurelius had to get creative to find new recruits. He conscripted gladiators, slaves, and even Germanic mercenaries to fill the ranks. This was a big deal. The Roman army was traditionally made up of Roman citizens, so this was a sign of desperate times. The weakened army struggled to defend the empire's long borders, particularly against Germanic tribes along the Danube frontier. Marcus Aurelius spent much of his reign fighting these wars, and the plague made his job infinitely harder. The economy also took a massive hit. With fewer people to work the fields, farm production dropped. Trade routes, which had unintentionally helped spread the disease, became disrupted. Tax revenues fell because there were fewer taxpayers and less economic activity. The emperor even had to sell off some of the imperial family's jewels and possessions to raise money for the state. The plague also had a profound psychological and religious impact. Many Romans believed the gods were angry. There was an increase in religious fervor and a search for scapegoats. Christians, who were a growing minority at the time, were sometimes blamed and persecuted more intensely, as some Romans thought their refusal to worship Roman gods had brought divine wrath. However, the Christian response of caring for the sick, even non-Christians, reportedly won them some admiration and converts. Marcus Aurelius himself may have died from the plague in 180 CE, though this isn't certain. The Antonine Plague didn't cause the Roman Empire to collapse overnight, but it marked a turning point. It weakened the empire militarily and economically, and it shook the confidence of the Roman people. The golden age of Rome was dimming, and the long, slow process of decline was arguably accelerated by this devastating pandemic. It forced Romans to change how they recruited soldiers, how they managed their finances, and even how they thought about their gods and their place in the world. Number 6. The plague of Cyprian that made people leave the dying in the streets. Just when the Roman Empire thought things couldn't get much worse after the Antonine Plague, another monster showed up. Around 249 or 250 CE, during a period already filled with civil wars, economic chaos, and barbarian invasions known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century, a new epidemic struck. This one is called the Plague of Cyprian, named after Saint Cyprian, the Bishop of Carthage, a big city in North Africa, who wrote extensively about it. Cyprian's descriptions are terrifying. He wrote of a disease that caused constant vomiting and eyes that were inflamed with blood. For many, their feet or other parts of their limbs would rot away and fall off due to putrefaction. People would become incredibly weak, their bodies just wasting away. Hearing would be impaired, and eyesight lost. It sounds like an absolutely agonizing way to go. Some modern scholars think it might have been a hemorrhagic fever, possibly something like Engbo, or maybe even a pandemic influenza or measles again, but hitting a population with no immunity. Plague raged for nearly 2 decades, until about 270 CE. At its peak, it was said to be killing up to 5,000 people a day in the city of Rome alone. Imagine that many funerals, or rather, that many bodies, every single day. The total death toll across the empire must have been in the millions once again, further depopulating cities and countryside that hadn't fully recovered from the Antonine Plague. The social effects were devastating. People were so scared of catching the disease that they would abandon their sick relatives, leaving them to die alone in the streets. bodies piled up, unburied. Cyprian wrote about how the healthy would flee, plundering the goods of the dead or dying. It was a total breakdown of normal human decency and social order in many places. He described a world where the intestines are shaken with a continual vomiting, the eyes are on fire with the infected blood, that in some cases the feet or some parts of the limbs are taken off by the contagion of diseased putrefaction. He said the sheer number of dead bodies lying about taught men to look for death. This created a huge labor shortage, even worse than before. Farms were abandoned, mines closed down. This, of course, hit the Roman economy and the state's ability to collect taxes and recruit soldiers very hard. The empire was already struggling to fight off invaders like the Goths and the Sasanian Persians, and this plague further crippled its military strength. Several Roman emperors died during this period, some possibly from the plague itself. Interestingly, this plague had a significant impact on the rise of Christianity. While many pagans were fleeing and abandoning the sick, Christians following the teachings of compassion often stayed to care for them regardless of their religion. Cyprian urged his fellow Christians to nurse the sick and bury the dead, even their persecutors. This courage and compassion in the face of such horror impressed many people. Historical accounts suggest that Christian communities, through their organized care, may have had higher survival rates. This demonstration of faith in action won many converts to Christianity. Plague, by creating chaos and despair, may have made people more open to the Christian message of hope, salvation, and an afterlife. Plague of Cyprian didn't destroy Rome, but it deeply scarred it, contributed to the ongoing political instability, military weakness, and economic depression of the crisis of the 3rd century. It changed the religious landscape too, boosting the appeal of Christianity. The empire that emerged from this crisis period was a different one, more militarized, more autocratic, and increasingly more Christian. Partly thanks to the horrific experiences and societal shifts caused by this terrible disease. Number 5. The Plague of Shiro, that decapitated an empire on the eve of conquest. While the Roman Byzantine Empire was reeling from its own plagues, its great rival to the east, the Sasanian Empire of Persia, modern-day Iran and Iraq, faced its own catastrophic epidemic. This one is known as the Plague of Shiro, and it struck around 627 to 628 CE. It got its name because it coincided with the reign of Kavad II, also known as Shiro, who had just overthrown and murdered his own father, the famous King Khosrow II. Talk about a bad start to a reign. The Sasanian Empire had just come out of a long, exhausting war with the Byzantine Empire. This war had lasted for decades and had drained both empires of resources and manpower. Khosrow II had actually been very successful for a while, conquering vast Byzantine territories. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius made a stunning comeback, and the Sasanians were defeated. It was in this atmosphere of defeat, political turmoil, and regicide that the plague hit. Details about the symptoms of the Plague of Shiro are a bit scarce compared to Roman plagues, but it was deadly. Often thought to have been another outbreak of bubonic plague, the same disease that caused the earlier plague of Justinian. What we do know is that it ripped through Mesopotamia, the heartland of the Sasanian Empire, and its capital city, Ctesiphon. The death toll was enormous. Crucially, the plague killed King Kavad II, Shiro himself, after only a few months on the throne. Not only that, but it reportedly killed most of his male heirs as well. This threw the Sasanian Empire into absolute chaos. With the king and his potential successors dead, there was a massive power vacuum. What followed was a period of intense civil war and instability. In the space of about 4 or 5 years after Shiro's death, a whole succession of weak rulers, including queens and generals, tried to claim the throne only to be quickly overthrown or killed. The empire was literally tearing itself apart from the inside. Imagine a powerful kingdom already weakened by war, suddenly losing its leader and most of its ruling class to a disease. Its administrative structures would crumble. Its armies would be in disarray, especially if the plague was also killing soldiers and commanders. This internal chaos and weakness couldn't have come at a worse time for the Sasanians, because just over the horizon, a new unified force was emerging from Arabia, the early Islamic armies. Fired up by their new faith, these armies began to launch raids and then full-scale invasions into both Byzantine and Sasanian territories in the 630s CE. The Byzantine Empire, also weakened by plague and war, struggled to resist. The Sasanian Empire, ravaged by the plague of Shiro and the subsequent civil wars, was in an even worse state. Its armies were disorganized, its leadership was fractured, and its population was likely demoralized and depleted. The Sasanian defenses crumbled surprisingly quickly against the Arab onslaught. Major battles were lost, and Ctesiphon, the magnificent capital, fell in 637 CE. The last Sasanian emperor, Yazdegerd III, became a fugitive, and by 651 CE, the once mighty Sasanian Empire, which had rivaled Rome for centuries, ceased to exist. It was absorbed into the rapidly expanding Islamic Caliphate. While the Arab conquests were driven by many factors, the plague of Shiro played a significant, if often overlooked, role. By decimating the Sasanian leadership and contributing to years of internal strife, the plague critically weakened the empire at the exact moment it faced its greatest external threat. It didn't just kill people. It helped to kill an entire empire, reshaping the political and religious map of the Middle East forever. Number 4. The Amwaz Plague that tested the faith of a new empire. As the Sasanian Empire was collapsing, a new power was rising: the Islamic Caliphate. But this new empire wasn't immune to the ancient enemy of pestilence. Around 639 CE, a devastating epidemic struck the region of Syria and Palestine, which had recently been conquered by the Muslim armies from the Byzantines. This outbreak is known as the Plague of Amwaz, or Emmaus, named after a town in Palestine where it was particularly severe. This plague is believed to have been another appearance of bubonic plague, possibly a continuation or resurgence of the same pandemic wave that included the plague of Justinian and the plague of Shiro. It hit the Arab armies and the local populations hard. At the time, many Arab soldiers and administrators were stationed in garrison towns in the newly conquered territories, and these crowded conditions likely helped the disease spread rapidly. The Plague of Amwaz is famous in early Islamic history because it killed many prominent figures, including some well-known companions of the Prophet Muhammad. These were individuals who had known Muhammad personally and were highly respected leaders in the early Muslim community. Their deaths were a huge blow. Imagine the founding generation of a new movement or nation suddenly being decimated by disease. It would have been a profound shock and a severe test of faith for the early Muslims. Among the notable figures who perished were Abu Uwaidah ibn al-Jarrah, one of the Prophet's closest companions, and the commander of the Muslim armies in Syria, Yazid ibn Abi Sufyan, another important commander and governor, and Suhail ibn Amr, a respected Meccan leader who had later converted to Islam. The Caliph, at the time Umar ibn al-Khattab, was deeply concerned. He was on his way to visit Syria when he heard news of the plague. His advisors were divided on whether he should proceed into the plague-stricken area or turn back to Medina. Umar famously decided to return, citing a saying of the Prophet Muhammad about not entering a land where there is plague and not leaving it if you are already there, an early form of quarantine advice. This decision became a significant precedent in Islamic jurisprudence regarding how to deal with epidemics. The mortality rate was very high. Some historical sources say that 20,000 to 25,000 Muslim soldiers died in the plague of Amwaz, along with countless local inhabitants. This was a significant loss of manpower for the rapidly expanding caliphate. Temporarily slowed down the pace of Muslim conquests in some areas, as armies had to be reconstituted and new commanders appointed. The plague also had economic consequences. Syria was a rich province, and disruption caused by the epidemic would have affected agriculture, trade, and tax collection. There were also social and demographic shifts. Some areas were depopulated, and there were debates among early Muslim scholars about things like inheritance rights for those who died in the plague and the status of land left vacant. Despite the heavy losses, the early Islamic Caliphate managed to weather the storm of the Amwaz plague. The leadership remained resilient, and the expansion continued after a pause. However, the plague left a lasting mark on early Islamic consciousness. It served as a stark reminder of human vulnerability even for a triumphant new power. It led to important theological discussions about divine will, suffering, and martyrdom, as those who died in the plague were sometimes considered martyrs. The response to the plague, particularly Caliph Umar's decision to avoid the infected region, helped shape early public health approaches within the Islamic world. It was a crisis that tested the young empire's faith, leadership, and resilience, and in doing so, helped to forge its character. Number 3. The Plague of Justinian, that halted an emperor's dreams and darkened the world. Picture this: the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I, ruling from Constantinople in the 6th century CE, is on a roll. He's reconquering lost Roman territories in Italy, North Africa, and Spain. He's building magnificent structures, like the Hagia Sophia. He's codifying Roman law. It looks like he might just restore the Roman Empire to its former glory. Then, in 541 CE, disaster struck. A new and terrifying plague arrived in Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire, likely carried by rats on grain ships. This was the first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague, the infamous disease caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The historian Procopius of Caesarea, an eyewitness, left chilling accounts of the plague of Justinian. He wrote that it often started with a mild fever, but soon victims developed painful swellings, the infamous buboes in their groin, armpits, or neck. These buboes could grow as large as a child's head. After the buboes came delirium, coma, or agonizing pain. Some people developed black pustules all over their bodies. Others vomited blood. Many died within days. Procopius said the ways people died were so varied and strange that doctors were baffled. He wrote that, at first, it was not easy to find a single man who had suffered from it. Then, it came to pass that every place was filled with the afflicted. Plague spread like an unjobbable tide, following trade routes across the Byzantine Empire and beyond, reaching Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and even possibly as far as Britain and Ireland. It hit Constantinople, the empire's massive and crowded capital, with particular ferocity in 542 CE. At its peak, Procopius claimed that 10,000 people were dying per day in Constantinople. While this number might be an exaggeration, the death toll was undeniably catastrophic. Bodies piled up so fast that there was no time or space for proper burials. Special pits were dug, towers were filled with corpses, and bodies were even loaded onto ships and dumped at sea. The stench of death hung over the city. Justinian himself caught the plague, but incredibly survived. However, his empire was grievously wounded. Modern estimates suggest that the plague of Justinian in its first wave alone may have killed up to 25 to 50 million people, perhaps 13 to 26% of the world's population at the time. In some urban centers, mortality rates might have reached 40% or even higher. Plague didn't just go away either. It recurred in waves every few years for over 2 centuries, until the mid-8th century, continually grinding down the population. Consequences were immense and far-reaching. Justinian's ambitious military campaigns to reconquer the Western Roman Empire faltered. He couldn't recruit enough soldiers, and the territories he had already retaken were depopulated and harder to control. His dream of a fully restored Roman Empire died with the millions who perished. Economically, the empire was devastated. Agriculture collapsed as farmers died or fled their lands. Trade shriveled. Tax revenues plummeted, making it difficult for the state to fund the army or public works. There were severe labor shortages, leading to rising wages for those who survived, but also to abandoned lands and declining production. The intricate system of Roman administration and supply struggled to cope. Society was transformed. The sheer scale of death led to widespread despair, fear, and religious fervor. Some people turned to intense piety, while others, according to Procopius, indulged in every kind of vileness. There was a shift in art and culture, with more somber and religious themes emerging. Plague accelerated the decline of classical Greco-Roman urban culture in many areas. The plague of Justinian is considered one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. It didn't just kill millions, it fundamentally altered the trajectory of the Byzantine Empire, checked its expansion, and weakened it for centuries to come. It contributed to the onset of the early Middle Ages, often somewhat unfairly called the Dark Ages in Europe. As populations declined, trade networks fractured, and societies struggled to recover. The world that emerged from the shadow of Justinian's plague was a very different, and in many ways a much emptier and more uncertain place. Number 2. The Roman plague of 590 CE that made a pope led processions through death. Even after the initial devastating wave of the plague of Justinian in the 540s, the nightmare wasn't over. That particular strain of bubonic plague kept coming back again and again, for roughly 2 centuries haunting the Mediterranean world and Europe. One of these particularly grim recurrences hit the city of Rome hard in 590 CE. Rome, once the capital of a vast empire, was by this time a shadow of its former self, politically diminished, often caught in the crossfire of wars, and now repeatedly struck by pestilence. This outbreak coincided with a period of great difficulty for Rome. The Lombards, a Germanic people, were invading Italy and threatening the city. Floods had recently devastated the countryside, leading to famine. And then, the plague returned with a vengeance. The symptoms were likely similar to those described by Procopius for the earlier wave: fevers, agonizing buboes, and rapid death. The city was filled with despair. Pope Pelagius II, the leader of the Christian Church in Rome, died from the disease in early 590 CE. Into this crisis stepped one of the most influential figures in early medieval history, Gregory, who was elected pope in September 590 CE and became known as Gregory the Great. Faced with a city consumed by plague, famine, and fear, Gregory decided that spiritual warfare was needed. He believed the plague was a divine punishment for sin, and that the city needed to repent collectively. So, Pope Gregory organized huge citywide religious processions. These were called Litaniae Septiformes, or sevenfold litanies. He divided the population of Rome into 7 groups: clergy, abbots and monks, abbesses and nuns, men, married women, widows, and finally the poor and children. Each group was to start from a different church in Rome and march through the streets, chanting prayers and psalms, all converging on the Basilica of St. Mary Major. Imagine these somber parades winding through a city where people were dying in their homes and on the streets, the air thick with the smell of sickness and the sounds of mourning mixed with desperate prayer. According to tradition, these processions took place over several days. Gregory himself walked barefoot in one of them. Chronicles of the time, particularly those by Gregory of Tours, a contemporary historian, not the Pope, paint a grim picture. He wrote that during one of these very processions, 80 people collapsed and died from the plague within a single hour. It's a stark image. People marching to beg for an end to the plague, only to be struck down by it as they prayed. However, there's a famous legend associated with this plague and Pope Gregory's actions. The story goes that as one of the processions approached the mausoleum of Hadrian, a massive tomb originally built for the Roman Emperor Hadrian, Gregory saw a vision. He looked up and saw the Archangel Michael atop the mausoleum, sheathing his flaming sword. Gregory interpreted this as a sign that God's wrath was appeased and that the plague would soon end. And indeed, the epidemic did eventually subside in Rome. In honor of this vision, the mausoleum of Hadrian was later renamed Castel Sant'Angelo, Castle of the Holy Angel, and a statue of Michael sheathing his sword was placed on its summit, where it can still be seen today. While the plague did wane, it had already taken a terrible toll. It further reduced Rome's already diminished population and added to the city's misery. However, Pope Gregory's response had a lasting impact. His leadership during this crisis solidified the authority and prestige of the papacy, not just as a spiritual leader, but also as a civil one, capable of organizing and comforting the people of Rome in a time of extreme distress. Practice of holding penitential processions and offering public prayers during calamities became more common in the Christian West. This outbreak and Gregory's response to it highlighted the deep intertwining of faith, suffering, and leadership in a world repeatedly battered by forces it couldn't understand or control, shaping religious practices for centuries. Number 1. The Japanese smallpox epidemic that cleared the way for a new religion. Far from the crumbling Roman world, on the islands of Japan, another ancient civilization was facing its own existential threat from disease. In 735 CE, a terrifying epidemic of smallpox swept across the country. Smallpox, for those unfamiliar, is a horrific disease. It causes high fevers, vomiting, and then a characteristic rash of fluid-filled blisters that cover the entire body. These blisters become pustules, then scabs, and if the person survives, they are often left with deep, disfiguring scars. Blindness was also a common complication. And of course, it was often fatal, especially in populations that had never encountered it before. What we call virgin soil epidemics. This particular outbreak in Japan is thought to have been brought back by a Japanese envoy returning from the Korean kingdom of Sia. It first appeared in Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main islands, and then spread rapidly eastward, reaching the capital city of Nara, then called Heisho-kyo, in 737 CE. The capital was a relatively new planned city, modeled on the Chinese Tang dynasty capital, and it was quite densely populated for the time. This made it a perfect breeding ground for the highly contagious virus. The results were catastrophic. Historical records from Japan, like the Shoku Nihongi, describe the devastation. It's estimated that between 1/4 and 1/3 of the entire population of Japan, died in this epidemic. That's a staggering number. Perhaps 1 to 1.5 million people out of a total population of around 4 to 5 million. Imagine losing 1 out of every 3 people you knew. The impact on society would have been unimaginable. The ruling class was hit particularly hard. 4 brothers of the powerful Fujiwara clan, who were effectively the main ministers and held immense political power at the imperial court, all died from smallpox within a short period in 737 CE. Their names were Machimaro, Fusasaki, Umakai, and Maro. Their sudden deaths created a huge power vacuum at the heart of the Japanese government. This had significant political consequences, allowing rivals of the Fujiwara to gain influence temporarily. Beyond the political elite, the epidemic caused widespread social and economic disruption. So many farmers died that agricultural production plummeted, leading to food shortages and famine in the years that followed. Labor became scarce, and many public works projects, including the construction of temples and government buildings, had to be halted. There was widespread fear and panic. People fled infected areas, which of course sometimes helped to spread the disease further. In the face of such overwhelming death and suffering, people desperately sought explanations and solace. At the time, Shinto was the native religion of Japan, a system of beliefs centered on nature spirits called kami. But Buddhism, which had been introduced from Korea and China a couple of centuries earlier, was gaining influence, especially among the elite. The devastating smallpox epidemic seems to have given Buddhism a massive boost. Emperor Shomu, who reigned during this period, was a devout Buddhist. Deeply affected by the suffering of his people and the loss of so many officials, he turned increasingly to Buddhism. He believed that the plague was a sign of the country's moral failings, or perhaps the anger of protective deities. He embarked on a massive program of Buddhist temple construction and sponsorship, hoping to win divine favor and protect the nation. Most famously, he ordered the construction of the Todaiji Temple in Nara, which would house a gigantic bronze statue of the Buddha Vairocana Daibutsu. He also ordered the establishment of provincial temples, kokubunji, throughout Japan. These actions had a profound and lasting impact on Japanese civilization. The state's lavish patronage of Buddhism greatly increased its prestige and influence. Buddhist rituals and prayers became central to state functions. While Shinto remained important, Buddhism became deeply embedded in Japanese culture, art, and spirituality. The epidemic, by creating a crisis of faith and a desperate search for protection, effectively cleared the way for Buddhism to become a dominant religious force in Japan. It also led to the government taking a more active role in public health, such as establishing charitable dispensaries, though medical knowledge was still very limited. The smallpox epidemic of 735 to 737 CE didn't just kill a huge portion of Japan's population. It fundamentally reshaped its religious landscape and the relationship between the state and religion for centuries to come.